Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Joseph Lambert. I'm from Cardiff University in Wales in the UK. Today I'm going to be talking to you about codes of ethics, as you can guess by the title on the slides there. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about potential mismatches that exist, how codes line up with the translation profession today. Okay, so before I dive straight in, I'm going to give a brief overview of today's talk. So I'll start off by thinking about the state of codes of ethics generally in translation. So what exactly are they? Very briefly, I'm sure you all have a very strong understanding of that already, but also where they are in terms of the academic literature on the topic. And then what I'll do, because that literature tends to be a little bit patchy and a little bit out of date in places, I'm going to offer an updated sketch of where codes are today, and then think about their relationship with the profession as it is happening now. So this dynamic profession that we're all involved in. After looking at a few insights from there based on my ongoing research, I'll think about code suitability as sites of in-depth guidance. So thinking about why exactly are there still shortcomings in these codes? Is there something inherent within the codes? Is there something that we can do to change this? And that leads me to the final section, which is thinking about potential paths forward. So things that we can change, ways to innovate. So potential modifications that we can make to codes, alternative formats that we could use, or if there are other fields that can inform our progress in translation. Okay, so to start off with, just thinking briefly about the state of codes of ethics. Now, apologies for the slightly text-heavy slide there. Codes are well established now as these institutionally embedded documents. So it was sort of the 1990s when they first came into vogue, really, and now pretty much every translation association, every translation agency has a code of practice, code of ethics, code of conduct, using these names pretty much interchangeably. And what they seek to do is offer principles of practice for translators. So typically things like you should be accurate, you should be confidential, you should respect confidentiality. But beyond this, they also act as a symbolic badge of honor. And this is an important point that will come back a few times throughout the talk. They confer this elevated status to the translation profession and increase trust in the translation profession as well. So they're a badge of honor as well as being a sort of ostensibly translator-facing document. Now, in translation studies, there is some engagement with codes, but it's relatively sparse. But even within these few contributions, we see a number of shortcomings within the codes. So things like coverage, the codes are not touching upon things that are relevant to translators, which will come to the fore in a little while. Things like problems of enforcement. Can you actually put these principles into practice? Are drawn out, internal conflicts and contradictions within the codes, and then the issue of can we really capture this contextual nature of translation, which is so wide-ranging within a few simple guidelines. Okay, and one of the most influential papers in terms of pointing out these shortcomings and in terms of literature on codes of ethics more generally in translation is Julie McDonough-Dolmayer's 2011 paper, which studies 17 translation codes of ethics and draws attention to these shortcomings. And that's kind of the starting point for where my research is right now. As this was, McDonough-Dolmayer's paper was, and it remains pretty much the only published paper to focus specifically on a study of the translation profession and codes. There were a few others in terms of interpreting that came before, but translation doesn't really have anything else there. And given that this paper is now 10 years old, I thought what I'd do is try and offer something of an updated picture. So I drew together a corpus of codes, so 20 codes that are currently in force across translation and interpreting, to try and consolidate the conclusions that were there, see if things have changed in the last 10 years, just give us this updated reflection. And these codes, you can see them all on the slide. I mean, you can't read them there, but they came from a range of sources. So in terms of institution, there are some from agencies, some from associations, some from national bodies of translation, from a range of practices. So some from translation, some interpreting, and sign language interpreting and editing as well are important ones that I'll draw attention to later. And also geographical locations. Now, the point of this was to try to develop a sort of comprehensive, in a way, image, a global image, to see if there were any indicators of good practice or any exceptions to the general conclusions that we're seeing elsewhere in the world or in terms of other practices. So this is why I went for such a wide range in these codes, and that's important in terms of the sort of paths forward that I mentioned later on in the presentation. So I don't have time to mention all of the insights that have come out of these this sort of study of the codes now, but I'll give you a few sort of general important takeaway points that came to the fore straight away. And one of the main things that I noticed is that these codes are pretty much the same as they were 10 years ago. So in general, they've remained pretty much static across time. So in 10 years, they haven't changed much. Space, so across different countries, continents, they're pretty much the same across languages and across even practices as well. So translation and interpreting are often sort of using the same guidelines despite being quite distinct practices, as we know. A quick stat to that effect: of the 16 codes that did have a date on them, so 16 out of the 20, only 2 of them have been updated since 2017, and many of them are much older. So the FIT's Translators Charter, for instance, was last updated in 1994, which is probably one of the oldest ones still in effect there. And what we find is that the same principles that McDonough-Dolmeyer and other scholars have spoken about in the past are still enshrined across these codes. So we're talking about competence, impartiality, accuracy, continuing professional development. All these same things are still there, but nothing has been added. So these codes are static, but the profession, on the other hand, has continued to change over the past 10, 20 years. And we know that it's a dynamic profession where things are happening, things are moving on a regular basis. And to that effect, I want to draw attention to 2 areas in particular that are missing in the codes. So as the codes have remained static, there are key areas that continue to be ignored. And the 2 that I want to look at, for a couple of reasons that I'll mention shortly, are rates and technology. Now, these elements are flagged, first of all, in the research on codes of ethics. So McDonough-Dolmeyer points out rates and technology as elements that are missing in codes. Lynn Boker, as well, in her chapter on translation, technology and ethics, talks about how codes don't engage fully with technology. They're also mentioned by translators themselves. So on the right-hand side of the slide there, you can see the ITI Pulse survey from 2020, which asked about ethical dilemmas, and rates was the most common response. So translators saying that they've had ethical issues with rates being offered. And similarly, at the bottom right there, Inbox Translation, a UK-based translation association, surveyed freelance translators and found that rates of pay was the #1 challenge translators are facing. And number 3 on there was the increasing use of machine translation as well, so technology feeding in there. So these are elements that are relevant to practicing translators. And there are also emerging areas of concern in terms of discussions of ethics. So certainly in recent years, translation scholars have been thinking about how do we engage with technology? What ethical issues do exist when we're talking about the tech that we're using as translators? And rates slowly, maybe slightly less so, but sort of filtering in very slightly. So I'll offer a few quick insights on these 2 areas, because I think they're most pressing areas, and also the most problematic in the way that the codes are, or rather are not, representing them. So in terms of rates, 10 of the 20 codes had no mention of rates at all. Okay, this is in line with what was found 10 years ago. And so again, this static image of codes. So despite professionals talking about them, codes of conduct don't talk about rates. When they do, so when they are mentioned, it's generally just a rather abstract label such as you shall accept fair rates, not unreasonable rates, decent rates, with no further clarification. And none of the codes that I've studied offered a specific rate above or below which translators should be working. An interesting exception to this was mentioned by Julie McDonough-Dolmeyer, again, whose paper I'll keep going back to, in the South American context rather, where a couple of codes did actually offer specific rates, usually in the form of a supporting website or a supporting link on the agency's website. Okay, so a couple more insights into rates there on the slide. As I said, I can't really touch upon all of these in full now, but this shows you that this is an area of concern. Still, it's something that isn't being addressed or hasn't been addressed yet. In terms of technology, the picture is even more problematic. So despite the fact that tech is increasingly central in the translation profession, there are more technologies out there, translators are using this technology, and we're having to engage with these fast pace of technological change. And technology being increasingly considered from an ethical perspective in translation studies, none of the codes surveyed mentioned technology at all. So at most, we find a tenuous link in relation to continuing professional development. So ORCIP, for instance, recommends that members keep up to date with technological advances, which is good advice, but this is as good as it gets. And unfortunately, this is quite problematic because codes cut across so many of the really important ethical values that are enshrined in most codes. So they feed into issues of confidentiality, issues of fair practice. The question of rates comes in terms of codes, discounts for matches, rates offered for post-editing, things like this. This question of environmental sustainability is coming forward, questions of quality, and finally, of course, copyright and ownership of resources. So this is something that's really, really pertinent and something that is not reflected in codes at all. So this is one of the most problematic areas to point out, I think. Now, there's a couple of insights into the state of codes and sort of how they relate to the profession today. Now I want to just briefly think about why these elements are absent. So I suppose the first thing to say is that many people, I suppose, would think they fall beyond the scope of codes. They're not ethical issues, particularly, or they fall beyond our understandings of ethics. I would argue that the fact that translation professionals are saying rates, technology, these are the most pressing ethical issues we're facing, kind of discounts that. One thing that I sort of posit in this regard is that these codes actually aren't always seeking to be guides for translators, but rather acts as client-facing marketing tools. So they're not seeking to enshrine, the realities of professional practice, but rather to give a positive, ethical, marketable selling image to potential clients, unfortunately. Other issues in terms of rates, in particular, potential legal issues. So in the UK and the US, definitely potential competition or antitrust laws against price fixing come into effect, though we've seen, or I mentioned, that the South American context shows there are exceptions to this. For rates also, potentially, this is symptomatic of a wider economic vacuum in the industry and the discipline. In translation studies, we don't tend to talk about rates. Students are always concerned about it, but actually finding literature, being able to help them is problematic. So a potential area for future consideration. And one final point, these are all quite hypothetical points. I think one thing that could be considered as potential problematic is this focus on social responsibility, which is in itself is a very good thing, but arguably the jump to thinking about our relationship on a wide scale level, thinking about our responsibility in terms of others, arguably this occurs at the expense of the economic conversation that is yet to happen on the required scale. Okay, so another question that comes to the fore as well in terms of these doubts that we have over why rates, why technology, for instance, why other elements aren't there in codes is, are we asking these codes to do too much? Now, that quote from Mickelson is a useful starting point here. So a code of ethics is not designed to provide an answer to every specific problem. And undoubtedly, the context-based nature of translation, potential legal constraints that I mentioned, the fast pace of technological change all make it very difficult to enact these changes and to come up with something that everyone's going to say, yeah, that works really well for me. That's informing my decision-making as a translator. But I would say at the same time, while there is a danger of asking them to do something that they can't, there is clear scope for improvement. They can offer better close-ended answers. I'm not asking them to provide an answer to every single problem, but not touching upon the question of technology, not touching upon rates, not addressing these issues that translators are facing is problematic, and they can offer better close-ended answers at the very minimum. And fortunately, within this corpus that I constructed, there are several outliers, I suppose, that demonstrate potential areas or potential methods for improvement, ways that we can maybe move beyond this typical static, codified, just kind of a PDF document that associations lump on their site and then leave forever to gather dust. So I'll go through those now, these potential ideas for future development in terms of codes. Now, the most obvious starting point, I would argue, is rewording, revising, or adding something to the codes that are there. This was something noted by Andrew Chesterman in a paper on ethics touching upon codes a couple of years ago, saying that regular updates are surely an obvious first step. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I said that codes, most of these haven't been updated for years. And the one that has been updated, the ATC code, the Association of Translation Companies, kind of alludes to this potential value of revision. So it does actually touch upon, in the guidelines that I've flagged there, which are a little bit small on the slide, but trust me that they're there, it touches upon data security and quality, two issues that are generally missing in the context of codes. This is aimed towards translation companies rather than translators themselves, which alludes to the potential of other fields, other areas informing us as translators. But obviously, as a first step, we can simply add things in about rates, codes, rates, technology, quality, etc. Okay, but there are other more transformative examples that I found as well. Now, one really interesting, or potentially interesting, inclusion is these paratextual inclusions with code. So introductions to codes, commentaries, explanations to assist in understanding, interpreting various guidelines, various points within the code. So the NCIHC, Healthcare Interpreters Body, has an extended introduction explaining ethics itself and the process of drafting the code, which is an innovative inclusion. The ORCID code has a breakdown of each, an explanation of each guideline within there, which I think has the potential to do well, but it's worth noting, particularly in the context of their explanation of accuracy, for instance, that these actually often serve to reinforce problematic points. So it's not a case of simply, let's bung more in there and it'll be automatically a good thing. We need to reflect on how to do this in the most effective manner. The ATA also has a separate commentary document as well. And so there is scope for doing this. A few places have worked on this, but there's definite scope for improvement within this method as well. Now, one really, really interesting example that I've studied in my corpus is the RBSLI, so the Regulatory Body of Sign Language Interpreters Code. As you can see on the slide, I've labeled this as accessible, aspirational, research-based, and reflecting moral independence. Now, first of all, I'll try and break those down very quickly. It has a video version in sign language, which is sort of specific to the practice, but in terms of accessibility, this is a great touch. It's underpinned by research into translation ethics. So it starts out with a quotation from Andrew Chesterton's prominent work from 2001 on ethics. They conceptualize the practitioner as an active participant in the interpreting process, not as a neutral conduit, which is often the case there. So this is, again, very innovative, very different to most other codes. And more generally, it tries to avoid this rule-based approach, instead being aspirational, aiming towards best practice rather than saying, you should do this. So a very, very interesting example to consider there. It does occasionally lapse into abstract guidance. So these problems are still there, and it doesn't touch upon elements such as rates or technology, which I mentioned before. So there's scope for improvement, but there are some really interesting elements there and elements of good practice that could inform other users of codes. Okay, a couple of quick ones. I mean, the JAT, Japanese Association of Translators, also has an interesting layout. So they have instead of a typical code, they have a section on a website called Working with Translators, with a section called How Much Will It Cost? A section Translator Ethics as well. So specifically aiming this at clients, breaking down why we charge what we do as translators, why translation is difficult, telling them what ethics entails for translators. This is a very different approach. Again, moves away. It's moving towards a potential post-code approach where we're changing the object of study. We're changing the format within which we're doing this. And the importance of providing a realistic image of what translation entails really comes to the fore there. So just a couple of quick pointers before I finish off. I realize I'm coming to the end of my time now. One final thing I'd note is insights from parallel fields as well. So the Editorial Freelancers Association, for instance, has a chapter on fees within their code of practice. And this points to this importance of looking beyond the immediate context of translation. Healthcare interpreters, again, there's other fields have dealt with these challenges, have tackled with the problems of codes, which are quite general. They're not specific to translation, all of them. And so this academic literature that has been developed, this professional engagement which is developed, can be really, really illuminating for us. A couple of conclusions. Despite by Charlie Olmos's argumentation, which I entirely agree with, that codes should not be static, but should be open, adaptive, fluid, progressive, dynamic, and changing entities. As I've studied, as I've seen, codes are very much static in their form and content, and they can go much further in terms of fostering ethical development among translators. A few outliers do show the possibility of potential postcode approaches, and these documents aim to reduce these contradictions, educate clients, call upon theory, and offer a more realistic image of the way practice is carried out, which I think is fascinating. Okay, so I'll stop there. I look forward to discussing these ideas with you during the conference very much. But if you do have any thoughts or suggestions and you want to get in touch afterwards or during the conference, my email address is there as well, and I look forward to speaking to you. So thank you very much.